So, Emma, I've been looking forward to this conversation since we met at the Integrative Testing Conference at NCIM, and I learnt a lot about what you were doing, and I'm really excited to share that with our listeners and viewers. So, welcome.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And it was lovely to meet you there as well. And I'm really, really excited to talk to you today.
Great. And I tend to just start with this question: why does integrative medicine matter to you?
I think instinctively, it's just been something in my life always. Just growing up in, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, I think life back then, and it is relatively recent in the history of humanity, was much more naturopathic, and that meant that we were out in fresh air, we were experiencing nature, we were eating real food without even thinking about it. It was just part of us. And I think instinctively, I've always felt better, even when I've been on a good trajectory of health, with a variety of inputs to my life rather than being in a mono mode. Variety is the spice of life, as they say. And then when it comes to more proactive health, I think there are times such as acute health situations where the focus needs to be on one thing, but more often than not, there are multiple causes for deteriorations in health, particularly in the modern world when it is much more about things that are long term rather than acute. Infections, for example, are less likely to kill us in the 21st century than in previous centuries. So it's often a consequence of multiple inputs that have contributed to either a health deficit or a health balance. And so it's never one thing, really.
Yes, we were just teaching this on the master's program at our intensive around what we call the holarchy, where you might look from subcellular to planetary health all the way through, and also how the illness can sit at different levels and interacting levels. So, that complexity, I just don't see how we can approach healthcare without models of complexity anymore.
Exactly, exactly. And I love all these layers that we examine. Even within the cell, there's the mitochondria
Yeah.
and the organelles within the cell. But often there are specialists that focus on one thing. And actually, we see mitochondria, for example, all over the place at the moment. And it is fascinating, and mitochondria are so, so important to the organism and to the planet. But actually, we do need to look at them in context, as you say. So, they don't just exist on their own, they are in cells.
Let's talk about them a bit more because they're one of my favorite things. But just to say that, a case of a young woman with chronic fatigue syndrome where someone was really focusing on the mitochondria, but in the bigger story of her life, the family had lost two babies early on in
Hmm.
her life, and this had had a profound effect. And she hadn't expressed that grief. So as you say, you want to know about your mitochondria, but you might have to chunk up, chunk down. But tell us about mitochondria, because some of our listeners don't even know that word. So can you tell us a bit about them?
So, they are best known as the powerhouses of the cell because they make energy or ATP, but they've got much bigger function than that. And indeed, they used to exist as separate organisms, as you will know, Elizabeth. So they are or were bacteria, and just like fact, the bacteria were eaten by cells, our cells, and eventually became part of them. So there is this mutual benefit to the mitochondria and the human cells and other mammalian cells, or all animals actually have mitochondria. And so they became a part of us where they are essential to our life and we are essential to theirs. And they are truly integrated into our biology from a genetic perspective as well. So people often talk about mitochondria having their own DNA, their own genome, which is true. But there's some really recent research which talks about mitochondria actually inserting their own DNA into the human nuclei DNA in order to affect how it works. So it's as if the two genomes are actually integrating with each other at that level as well.
Incredible. And I want to, obviously, your area of interest is genetics and nutrigenomics, but just to stay with the mitochondria, because it seems so fundamental in our lives and environment now that people suffer with fatigue. So are you able to say, how do we look after our mitochondria, knowing that they're these incredible powerhouses?
So they are powerful, but they're also delicate. And making energy is a little bit of a dirty business. So in the same way that when you think about burning a fossil fuel like coal or wood and that generates smoke, mitochondria are actually burning fuel. So whether that originated as carbohydrates or fats or even proteins, they're burning those fuels in an oxygenated environment. So they're using oxygen. So it is exactly the same biochemistry, generates byproducts. It generates toxic byproducts called reactive oxygen species. So it is like the smoke within them. And they do have a cleanup system, and that cleanup system is antioxidants. So the things that people have heard of, like vitamin C and glutathione, perhaps catalase is another one. But antioxidants are used by the mitochondria themselves to mop up that oxidative stress, the smoke effectively that is generated by burning the fuel for energy. The problems can happen when the mitochondria aren't as efficient at mopping up that oxidative stress, and that could be lack of the right nutrients, so insufficient fruits and vegetables and all the raw ingredients that provide the antioxidants. Or it could be that they're being overwhelmed from a fuel input perspective as well. So the bigger cellular picture, the context that the mitochondria are in, is partly there to protect them and to control the rate of the fuel being pumped in there. But some people can overeat, overconsume, and that can mean the mitochondria machine kind of spins faster but generates more smoke. And that can essentially poison them from within. And then there are dangers from the outside as well, from within the cell. So if the cell has insufficient antioxidants or is poisoned, and that could be a viral infection, so it could be an infectious condition, or it could be environmental toxins that are absorbed into our bodies and then into the cells, and they can damage the membrane of the mitochondria. And it's actually the mitochondrial membrane. It's a double membrane, and that is a really key part of both the ATP, the energy generation machinery, but it's also a barrier that protects them from their outside world. And if that barrier is weakened by these toxic environmental products or chemicals, then that again is another way that they can be damaged. They self-destruct, and there may not be as many of them, or the ones that are there may become incapacitated or at least compromised in their ability to do all the jobs that they do.
Yes, it's so clear for you to speak like this, and I feel like you're taking us into a deep dive into the cell, because I was also teaching about how teams saw in the COVID-19 pandemic that people with metabolic syndrome, and I think our listeners and viewers, I think, will understand that, but it's basically a state of inflammation in the body,
Yeah,
but they had less endoplasmic reticulum, which is the structure in the cell upon which the mitochondria sit. So it was almost like when they were hit with the COVID virus, which, as you say, could be toxic to the mitochondria, some people had fewer mitochondria to begin with, because also we're understanding that ultra processed foods can damage the cell as well as create inflammation through metabolic syndrome. So it's fascinating now, isn't it?
it is. And so many things come down to inflammation.
Mm.
And inflammation can feel quite intangible to people as well, because it's inside and there might not be any obvious visible signs. Certainly to a layperson, what are they looking for if
Mhm.
someone tells them they might be inflamed?
Mhm.
But yeah, metabolic dysfunction or being metabolically unhealthy to start with is definitely going to mean that there is a higher level of inflammation in the body, and chronic inflammation over time is going to be, again, I think of it as it's smouldering away
Mm.
over a long period of time, chipping away, causing lots of little damage that can stack up to more and more damage. And so when those people, those individuals then are hit by another assault, such as a viral infection, they're closer to the tipping point. They've got
Mhm.
less resilience. Metabolic resilience is something that is talked about quite a lot. We all want it, because it's the thing that will help us live longer and to live healthier during those longer years as well. We want our mitochondria to have the best capacity they can, and it will deplete over time, but we can manage that depletion, and we can slow it down and support that healthy picture for a very long time. I mean, there is no reason why people in their 70s and 80s can't be very physically, mentally, and socially active. That's all of
Absolutely.
our goals, isn't it, as health?
It is. And I was always very curious about some of the research coming through for cancer patients about how exercise seemed to really protect them from recurrence. And I wondered if you could illuminate a little bit. Is that because exercise also has a kind of a detoxification action and helps those mitochondria with the smoke that they're producing?
It does, actually. So, I mean, I'm a nutritionist, and the science that I specialise in is nutrigenetics, but that actually encompasses, back to the integrative health
Mm.
question, it encompasses looking at sleep, social, spiritual, and physical components and lifestyle factors. And exercise is the thing it's the tonic, it's the medicine that you can't bottle,
Mm.
and it is so, so good in many, many ways, but it's fantastic for mitochondrial resilience, basically. So a little bit of stress on the mitochondria by telling them, giving them this signal that there is more demand for their product. It's a signal to grow in
Mm.
capacity and
Mm.
become more robust. And that principle is hormesis, isn't it? And we hear about that in lots of contexts, but it's what doesn't kill you is going to make you stronger in a very small way, because we're talking about mitochondria, but it's giving them a good amount of stress
Mm.
that they are able to respond to positively and build that power, that resilience. Another way of looking at it is, or thinking about it, is the way we work a muscle. A muscle grows in response to the stress and the pressure and the load. And it's the same with the mitochondria. They're growing in number and also in their robustness and capacity in response to the training. We're training them.
The body's amazing, isn't it? And I suppose we must get on to the whole art of testing because, and I don't know the answer to this, I'm asking you without knowing, but can you test the function of mitochondria, either directly or indirectly?
There are many different approaches to testing. So you can test in a indirect way, things that we've talked about, like inflammation levels in the body. There are biomarkers for that. So quite straightforward, some of them. There are tests that you can get from a GP that are pretty bog standard if they're going to do a blood test for almost anything. Like if you're feeling weak, if there's something unexplained, they'll do a full blood count and it will include inflammation markers. So if those are raised, that's already a sign that that is going to be putting mitochondria under the wrong sort of pressure. And then there are things that are more direct. So there are quite recent, I think, recently developed tests that look at mitochondrial capacity and measure numbers of mitochondria. These are quite emerging sciences. They're not mainstream, but I think it's really, really useful to know that they exist. They're probably not things that everybody needs to keep an eye on all the time, but there might be situations where chronic fatigue being one of them, you know, unexplained, where people have tried so many things to just work out, you know, what is the problem with this person. And that's when you might go and look at some of those more specialized tests. And then from a genetic perspective, there are genes that we can look at that are actually our genes, as in the human, are nuclear genes, and by nuclear I mean in the cell nucleus. So it's the human genome as opposed to the mitochondrial genetics, because they are so intertwined. And a lot of the human cellular genes that are made in the cell nucleus, the genes make the proteins, and those proteins are then transported into the mitochondria and perform a lot of the roles that the mitochondria use them for. So the mitochondria are using our DNA as well as giving it messages as to when to express and what to do. There is also mitochondrial DNA, which is fascinating in itself because it is inherited through the mother. So it's the maternal line. Everybody's mitochondrial DNA, and therefore the character of their mitochondria comes from their mothers. There's a little bit of research that says maybe that sometimes is contaminated a little bit with father's mitochondrial DNA, but the vast 99.9% of it is through the mother line. And so we can actually look at family traits and inheritance and see that there are some traits that are passed down from mothers to sons. And yeah, it's super interesting. But mitochondrial DNA, if it is varied and inherited in a kind of mutated way, tends to be really serious. It tends to result in conditions that are discovered really early on in the early days of life. So that those sorts of genetic alterations or variations would be picked up in a hospital, usually because the baby isn't responding to feeding, for example, and it needs addressing very, very quickly. Whereas the nuclear DNA, the ones in our cells, the variation on that, again, some of that could be very, very serious, but the kind of genetics that I work with is much more common, the variances. So these are just often small changes in the genetic code some of them can make quite a big difference, some of them can make a small difference, but they are ultimately supportable. And that is such a key aspect of our work, that it's not about telling an individual they've got a terrible kind of genetic condition that can't be supported and no one can do anything about it. In fact, there aren't that many of those anyway, but the work that we do is all about things that are supportable through lifestyle.
Mhm.
And that is really the power. And indeed, most of the effects on the mitochondria are the things that we would be working with. If someone had lived beyond a few days, then they're things that we can help with
Mm.
through nutrition and lifestyle, as opposed to a lifelong pharmaceutical requirement, for example.
And how did you as a nutritionist get into the whole realm of gene testing and then set up your own company? Like, what was your journey?
So I got into this in my mid-40s, so it's a third career, really. But I do feel that it's the culmination of many, many things that have gone before. So it's as if all paths led here. So when I was at school, I had a very inspirational teacher, and he did after school class. He was a biology teacher. That's what his job was. But he ran genetic experiments after school for those of us who were interested, which sounds a bit weird. But back in the day, it was looking at fruit flies, which are still really used a lot in research, and just simply breeding them and looking at what colour their eyes were, what colour their wings were, what shape their tail was, and what happened when you mix these different combinations together. So it was teaching the basics of genetic inheritance, but in a really practical way, that once you get it, you've got it and you're never going to forget.
Amazing, amazing. He sounds inspirational, and I wish I had that teaching because it's still mystifying to me, but it sounds like, you saw it in action and it all started to drop into place.
Exactly, exactly. So that was fascinating. But then I was a little bit conflicted. We have a kind of ridiculous education system, I think, in the UK, which forces you to really narrow down your options at a very young age. And I found myself being told you can either do science or music. And it's not possible to do both. And I ended up plumping for the music, partly because I was under loads of pressure to do the science, and I just was at that age where I was like, the more someone tells me I must do something, the more I'm going to do the opposite. So I ended up doing music, which then I loved, and I did that at university. But I was quite frustrated that the general kind of view of musicians and music as a degree is that it's a bit of a fluffy subject, and you're playing your flute all day and that's all very nice, but that it's not a hardcore proper subject. But actually I would argue that it really, really is. And music is as much about science and structure and analytics as it is about art and creativity and performance. And that's what I loved about it, that it was actually all of those things. A bit back to the integrative kind of aspects, there is a parallel there, I think.
Definitely. My friend who plays piano, she's like a mathematician. She can just divide the sound up. And
Yeah.
I think if you've got this rhythm and sense of the structure behind the music, it gives you the freedom to be creative.
Exactly that, exactly that. And I think actually there are so many parallels between that and health.
Mm.
We need the science, we need facts, but we also need the art and the instinct and the experience and the skill as part of that therapeutic process. All those components and dimensions and perspectives contribute to understanding someone's health. And I think maybe I didn't realise it at the time, but I look back on it and I really do see it from that lens. So I did that. And then I did a bit of an odd thing as my dissertation, which my tutors, again, didn't really like. But I decided that it would be about autism and music therapy and how music can be a way of communicating for people who really find it difficult to communicate through voice, speech, eye contact, all those things. But sound and interaction in that way can be a different way through. So I started looking a lot about how the brain works as well, and from a communication perspective, and also emotional. So already I kind of felt as if I had a diverse set of interests, but there were connections between all these things. And then ended up not being able to really decide on a job, got a graduate offer to do IT programming. Again, quite technical, quite structured, very analytical, all those things. So I liked it from that perspective, but it was really missing any points for me, especially because it was in banking. You know, it's like, what's the purpose here? So long story short, I did decide to retrain in nutrition and I didn't know where it would take me. I didn't really care. I just knew that it was something that interested me on the health front. And I already knew about genetics. There was a lecture on nutrigenetics as part of my course. And as soon as that lecture had happened, I knew that I could use what I already knew to combine that with what I was learning about nutrition science, and what I cared about to do something which became eventually LifeCode. And so I could see that we could get hard facts, we could get data, which is this reading of your genetics. But the important thing always with information or data is to actually translate that into something meaningful and to put it in context. You know, like a piece of music, the music has no life until it's actually performed. You know, while it's just written on the page, it's just an instruction. And that is the same with genes. So the code is the code, but until it's brought to life, until it has life and energy injected into it, and until there are instructions prodding it and transcribing it, that's the word, again similar to music, but actually making those genes build a protein, an enzyme, a biological, physical component, then it isn't anything until that point. So nutrigenetics and nutrigenomics is all about this interaction of the environment that the genes exist in and the genetic code itself, and how the code responds to its environment and might respond for better or worse to different aspects of that environment. So I do think there are many, many parallels to all the different things that got me to working in this area.
It's amazing to hear it, and I had to make a decision as a doctor whether to go full-time into music or to be in medicine. And I chose to stay in medicine, but always was musical. And I talk about the art of holistic consulting being like jazz. You have to absorb the structures, absorb the word, the structure of the song, the meaning, and then you can apply it in a very individual way, depending on your audience, your environment. So it does feel that that plays a part for me with integrative healthcare. It also means that because it's constantly changing, you never get bored. You never sit with someone who's like anyone else you've sat with because of the multiplicity of factors. So I do
Exactly.
want to ask you, Emma, what do you feel has been one of, the most kind of groundbreaking bits of information that you can get that you can then manipulate through diet, exercise? Like what do you think is like what gave you great
The,
satisfaction when you could see?
I think the big things. So there are loads of moments actually where as a team we've gone, gosh, did you know this? Loads and loads of examples of that. But for me personally, I think I had persistent anxiety my whole life. And in fact, with the music, it was interesting because I did music because I wanted to perform, but I found it incredibly stressful to the extent that a teacher recommended that I take beta blockers in order to pass my exam. So to kind of calm me down and stop me shaking so that I could actually do what she knew that I was capable of. And it was this really constant annoyance to me, really, that I could sometimes, but I knew that if I was challenged to perform, even speaking, and you've seen now because you kindly invited me to speak at your conference. And although I will always be nervous as a speaker, I know that I can actually do it without melting down. I'm not going to break in the moment, and I don't take performance enhancing anything to be in that moment, but I do make sure that I've constantly got certain nutrients that I know are my weak points that can actually make a big difference to this overall bigger anxiety picture. And so one of the more specific or specialized panels that we put together is called the nervous system. I mean, in the world that we live in, I think everybody could probably benefit from looking at their nervous system in some way. But for me, the big moment was looking at GABA. So for people who don't know, I know that you do, but GABA is our inhibitory neurotransmitter. It's the major one, and it helps us be calm. It helps us wind down at the end of the day, and we need it. We need all the neurotransmitters at different times, but it's about having the right amount at the right time in the right place. And my pathway to making GABA was compromised genetically. So we mark these small differences in the DNA. If it's not working as well because of a little chip in the paintwork, we colour code it. So that one was red. And then there was also a chip in the code with respect to a GABA receptor. Now, receptor genes are all about how we respond to different chemicals in our environment. So we've got vitamin D receptors. So the vitamin D attaches to the receptor, and that tells our body to fight the virus, make our happiness serotonin neurotransmitter, build our bones, all those sorts of things. And with the GABA receptor, that's where the chemical, the neurotransmitter GABA binds to, and that creates the calming effect. And my GABA receptor just isn't as good at catching the chemical. So the chemical can be there, but it's not just always hitting the spot. It's not landing in the right place. And so that means the two things together, if I'm not making it very well and my receptor's not very good at catching it, it's missing half of it anyway, then I don't get as much of that calm. And so if I'm in a stressful situation, all my excitatory chemicals are firing like mad, like my adrenaline is surging and bouncing around, but I don't have enough of the calm to balance it out. And so this is happening to people all the time, that particular scenario, with adrenaline poking us whenever we nearly get run over by a bike or we get a nasty email or whatever it happens to be. But for most people, their GABA system should be trying to dampen that down and offset it. But equally, there are quite a lot of people, a significant proportion, who have this disadvantage built in genetically. So first of all, it was a bit of a relief. It was like, there's not something bad about me in terms of, am I just a weak individual with a poor personality? Like, why am I a quivering wreck in all these situations? But there is a genetic element. But the best of all, it's a nutrigenetic element. So there are nutrient aspects that can support this. So I can make sure that I've got good protein, and certain types of protein are specifically good at helping make GABA. Vitamin B6 is a nutrient that helps that making of the GABA. So that's the first step. So if I was also deficient in B6, then whoa. But if I've propped myself up with that and made sure it's optimal, then that's helping that first step. And then with the GABA receptor itself, we can support that by keeping the GABA that is there in play with things like rosemary and L-theanine. So rosmarinic acid is the active component of rosemary. It's in other herbs as well. And, and this exists in health food shops, and it's easy to get hold of, a rosemary containing tincture or rub that you can just put on your wrist when you know that you're going to encounter a slightly stressful situation. And just getting used to that, being able to breathe it, will actually help. And that's been proven as well to help people focus and perform better in exams, because it's allowing the mind to calm and therefore to be able to focus and recall and do all those things. So it helps with learning and it helps with recall. So it's not just about the meltdown and the acute situation. It's actually got much more far-reaching
And it's
effects.
also allowing, did you say, the GABA to arrive and stay on the receptor?
Yeah.
This is gold dust for me, because I've had real difficulties with my nervous system over the years, and I realized that I called it GABA deficient. I said, I can tell I'm GABA deficient. I didn't realize that one could test in that kind of accuracy. But I was also very interested. I had a gut test in the past few months, and that showed that I was deficient in GABA making healthy bacteria. So that's just on the edge of the technology. They can't tell me any more at the moment. But I think what's fascinating is suddenly those elements that you can support you, and then psychologically, that there's something that you can take. So
Exactly.
rosmarinic acid with L-theanine.
Yeah, exactly. So, we know that a good cup of tea is what would have historically, and still is where I'm from. So I'm from the north, I'm from Lancashire, and Yorkshire as well. It's like good cup of tea, strong cup of tea. You've had a shock, we'll sit you down,
Yeah.
have a cup of tea. So L-theanine in the tea is the calming factor that helps in that situation.
I hadn't made that connection. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's always something we can do. And I think that is the enriching aspect of this whole science. And, it's accessible as well. That's the thing. And even if, so I don't know if you've had your genetics tested, Elizabeth, but if you haven't, even if you haven't, by knowing the mechanics of this is how it works, actually you can benefit from the rosmarinic acid and the L-theanine.
I agree. And we are going to have to finish in a minute. I could talk to you forever, because what I love, like with the mitochondria and now with the GABA pathways, which have been a total fascination, but like a black box, it feels to me that you're able to articulate and describe. I could see the GABA kind of drifting and
Dripping
missing the
down.
receptor. And it's just beautiful, really, because as you say, knowledge is power. If we understand our bodies, and crucially, we're able, I remember quivering with my membership of the Royal College of Physicians exam, a practice exam, and a fellow doctor came up to me and said, "Poor you having that shaky thing." It was like pitying. And so you can also kind of take on, I'm weak, I'm not
Exactly.
able. And so just to know that those genes, and having a lot of anxiety in both lines of my family, both my father and my mother's side, suddenly you feel actually, that that makes sense, you know? That
Yeah.
yeah.
It's like a constitutional thing, but you can, now we know more,
Mm,
we can do more about it. Another thing that is so relevant to what you just described about your microbiome,
mm,
so a lot of fermented foods
mm.
actually provide GABA. So I'll send you a list.
Please do.
Again, they're really accessible. It is another example of, we know the microbiome impacts mental health, right?
Mm,
So we can get a lot of metabolites from microbiota. So the little critters chewing up the fiber that we provide for them and producing these chemicals that we
mm,
can then absorb, that can travel. Some of them can go through the blood-brain barrier and give us these calm feelings.
mm.
Um, and, you know, our ancestors, not so distant ancestors, would have eaten more fermented foods than people typically eat today. And some would have perhaps intuitively eaten the foods that made them feel calmer.
Yeah. And I love that, you know, Simon Mills, the well-known herbalist, always talks about his goat knowing what herbs to eat. And I think that we know that, like, the scurvy plant on the Dorset coast was given to the sailors by the wise woman of the village. And then we find out it's super high in vitamin C. So, you know, that's a mystery, isn't it? That intuitive knowledge.
Yeah.
But what I love is the way you're bringing science to, but as you say, like, the art and science of medicine and medical knowledge coming together is very beautiful.
I think that is why I love it. It's not just about, oh, I happen to get here because I like these things, but the excitement, the genuine excitement that we feel when we have these moments of, that's why. And as you described with the scurvy,
Mhm.
actually, there are things that we know, and maybe they're becoming forgotten because we're losing the art of passing on this amazing knowledge.
Mm.
Although I know that you and the
Very
college,
passionate about that.
exactly, exactly. But actually, the discovery of the why for me is often through researching the genetics.
Mm.
And then it will be all these things slot into place.
Amazing.
And once I know it, I'm never going to forget it.
Mm.
And I think that's the power for people as well. If you really know and you really understand, then you have in your mind, this is why I've grown to love eating this particular food or being in this particular environment. It could be being by the sea. It could be being in a forest. It could be eating something in particular. We might have just done something through instinct, or we might not. And if we haven't, then the genes can be the way to get there via the other route.
Well, look, I think we'll have to bring it to an end, but my deep thanks to you for bringing that knowledge so clearly and with such compassion and wisdom. That's what I really noticed when you taught, is this wisdom that also comes through. Thank you so much, Emma.
Thank you, Elizabeth.